So, Tim, when I was thinking this morning about procrastination, knowing we had this conversation, I kind of had a left field thought, which is how I wanted to start this conversation. And for whatever reason, I drew a similarity between somebody who is a chronic procrastinator and the mindset of almost an addict's brain. And that similarity came to me in terms of the overemphasis on short term comfort emotionally, short term gain, and the discounting of long term pain or long term gain. So I realize that's a left field starting point, but do you see the similarities in any way of somebody who is struggling with procrastination and the mindset of an addict in some ways?
Yes, of course. I don't want to say that procrastination is an addiction, but it's all about brain chemistry ultimately, right? Everything we're going to talk about is going to at some point come back to the brain. And the story of procrastination has to do, as you hinted at there, giving in to feel good. The present self wants to feel good now. Future self's not so important. Why? Well, the limbic system's kicked in, the emotional brain. Some people call it the reptilian brain because it's that older part of our brain we share even with the reptiles that most of your listeners would think of as fight or flight. And when that kicks in, that's a powerful neurochemistry happening there, right? And we would argue that it's an amygdala hijack. So that's one part of the limbic system, the amygdala. And your prefrontal cortex doesn't work the same way anymore. So certainly you see the same sort of compulsivity that you might see with an addict. Now, there are different pathways involved, and I'm not saying that procrastination is an addiction like that, but habits are habits.
When we kind of frame it in that way, it almost adds to the seriousness of the problem of procrastination. I know some people on the internet and some YouTube videos or some very simple self-help books or gurus would say it's just a productivity hack. You could do XYZ, but this seems like foundationally, once you're talking about brain chemistry, this is the human condition in many ways. This is very deep within us versus something that is very simple in one or two steps. Is that right?
Well, for sure, if it was simple, who would procrastinate anymore, right? I'm always leery of anything that just sounds too simple in operation. But that said, paradoxically, at some point I'm going to offer you some simple advice. It's just not easy to do, right? But no, it is a serious issue because, in life, Peter, there's only one non-renewable resource that you and I have, and that's time. So we're using some of it right now to do a podcast. We can't reclaim it. We don't even know how much of it we're going to get. So to waste time is the ultimate sin. And that's why I think in every world religion, there's the sin of sloth, right? That it's really human, as you say, it's a human condition to recognize I'm my own worst enemy here. I'm taking the most precious thing I have in the world, which is my time and my life, and wasting it away. And meanwhile, the other thing about procrastination is you end up stewing in your own juices. Like, I haven't met many happy procrastinators.
It's interesting when you talk about time being a non-renewable resource because that is so obvious. It is so simple to understand, yet it's something that we have a very hard time keeping top of mind, if that makes sense. It's something that maybe we choose to ignore. What do you think the psychology is behind that? Because that is such a profound statement, but it is so hard for me to wake up and say, I only have my time. It's not coming back. Why do you think as humans we push that to the background? Is it just a terrifying thought?
Well, good for you for grabbing onto terror because there is a terror management theory in psychology. And in fact, there are some psychologists who argue that when we think about our own mortality, it deeply terrorizes us and we push it away. Rather non-consciously, not in the unconscious Freudian sense of some libidinal energy, right? But non-consciously in the sense that we will not bring it forward to contemplate because it's just too overwhelming. So that, we could take that perspective. But I would argue that although it's deeply existential, that we don't want to think about these things, at the same time, what it is, it's just a habit. Let's think about where does procrastination come for most of us. It usually starts in school. You're facing a task that you don't want to do because it evokes emotions in you like resentment or boredom or frustration or anxiety. It might threaten yourself even, and you just don't want to do it. And so we learn that, gee, if I avoid the task, I can avoid those emotions, at least in the short term. And so avoidance becomes our go-to strategy. And the way to think about procrastination is an emotion-focused coping strategy. I'm using avoidance to make myself feel better right now. And what happens, we set up a pattern of avoidance. It becomes a habit, a prepotent response. And then we wonder, why am I doing this? Well, because you've always done it. You do it to try to make yourself feel better in the short run. And so we don't really even have to get into the fact that this is my life, why am I wasting it? It becomes a habit. And I think, with your first question, so do many other things that we do that are self-defeating, whether that be ingesting substances that only make us feel good in the short term but carry long-term problems, or spending money we don't have, or gambling too much, or eating calories we don't need. Sense that there's self-regulation failure. So that's the common theme there.
So, is it accurate to say in many ways the best approach is, on one end, the productivity, the practical steps that are, you make your list and you have you do your hardest thing first, but then on the other side, bringing it together in a more honest human way is recognizing that there are chemicals firing, that this is a human condition, that this is emotional easing. Do you bring those two worlds together, and is it a struggle to have the productivity half of your work and the deeply human emotional part of your work as well?
You've done your homework. You're a good interviewer, Peter. Like, those are great questions. Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
always a balance between these two things, manageability and meaning. And so, for example, in terms of recognizing that it's the human condition to want to feel good now, that allows us to be more self-compassionate. And we've found in at least one study that if we forgive ourselves for past procrastination, not to procrastinate in the future. Now, at first, that was counterintuitive to me. When my colleague said we'll study for self-forgiveness and procrastination, I laughed and said it'll be forgive and forget. Like, what's the point? And he found just the opposite. And it's really because we forgive ourselves, we're willing to try again. And that forgiveness needs to start with that notion of, this is the human condition, I'm going to screw up. So yes, on the one hand, we have to keep that in mind. Also, it's a sense for, like, I'm 66 now. And so I'm in a different place in my life than you are and most of your listeners. And so I have this deep sense of agency, and I can see the end of my life more clearly. And that brings that existential clarity. When you're a young person, you do have agency that this is my life. What do I want to make of it? Right? There's, of course, you don't have the same time urgent sense things could wait. Not, you can go as carpe diem, seize the day. Why not do with the day what you want to? And if it's to go and play, then by all means, go and play. But make that choice. Fall between the cracks of, I should be doing this, but instead I'm just, say, social media or binging on Netflix. That's the place where I think we get into that self and we're not product with regards to our own goals. Yeah.
You mentioned Netflix and social media, but we also talked about this being deeply human. Are these new innovations, these our cell phones, the addictive nature of social media, the emotional easing of a million shows on Netflix, have those made things fundamentally or measurably worse for procrastinators? Or is this, as long as human existence, that 100 years ago a good book was also our distraction as well, and that using social media is almost an excuse or a crutch, that this is just deeply human? Or have those kind of hijacked us at a high level?
Part of your question was these new technologies and what they do. Procrastination has always been around. And as a young guy, as a teenager, I procrastinated all the time. But sooner or later, I'd get bored, right? There was only so much to distract myself with. Like, TV only had a limited number of channels, and there's only so many magazines I could flip through. But now we've got devices in our hands, powerful computers that are just a bottomless pit of activity. And what happens is that we make a rational decision over irrationally short period of time. And by that, I mean, we say, hey, I'll just update my Instagram or my Snapchat. It will only take a minute. That's true. It will only take a minute. But a minute later, you face the same choice. And because you've made that one choice, you're likely to make it again. And that's why we all get to the point where we say we're going to do something for a minute, and 3 hours later, we're watching the video of a seal using an octopus or a squid to hit a kayaker in the head, and we think, how did I get here? I never chose to be here. Well, that's the point, right? We've got this bottomless time wasting. And so if we're trying to give in to feel good in today's age, we can really do a deep dive. And I think that's why even Marshall McLuhan predicted this, as did Neil Postman in Amusing Ourselves to Death, that the medium becomes just so addictive for us. So it's a problem that no other generation has faced quite the same way.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea or the myth of inspiration or motivation for any creative that is listening right now. I remember, especially when I was in high school, the idea of like my favorite artist would talk about the spark of inspiration or there's a spark of motivation. You can't rush art is something I would hear a lot. And as I've gotten older, I've realized the more bored you are when you just open that computer, you start typing or you start getting to work, eventually motivation can pretty predictably and inspiration can pretty predictably start to creep in. So I want to talk about the idea of spark of inspiration. Is it a myth or is it something that we should respect if you're a creative?
Okay, great question. Back in 2016, a psychologist by the name of Adam Grant wrote about this in the New York Times, and he argued, you need a certain kind of procrastination that's actually good for you. And I just went ape over that. Like, I'm thinking, my goodness, let's not modify the word procrastination. There are many kinds of delay in our lives, Peter. We delayed this interview, in fact, from earlier in August to now because I had a change in my summer schedule. I would call that inevitable delay in some ways because it was inevitable that holidays change with the kids I'm trying to juggle. And then there could be purposeful delay that I look at my schedule and go, this has to wait while I'm doing this because this is more important. And then there can be delay due to emotional problems. Like, life goes on, things happen. We come off the rails, but it's not because we're terrible procrastinators. It's because we're dealing with stuff and we have to work through the emotional stuff first. So there's all sorts of reasons to delay. So let's go back to creativity. So yeah, you're right. Sometimes you're not ready to write, or you're not ready to put together a melody, let's say, because you picked on some songwriting as an example. But that means you're just going to delay. But if you're saying it to yourself like, oh, procrastination pays, I don't have to feel like it right now, that's just making an excuse for yourself. And so we do find that purposeful delay is a thing in life, and you can do this. But every artist I've talked to that's successful, they know that what's the first thing that rule for that? You have to show up, right? And so writers sit down at the same time every day. And artists, I read one book on composing that a person that I went and gave a general talk to in Toronto came up to me afterwards and said, you bet, I just finished reading this book on composing, and they say you got to get under that piano and just chew on the carpet till it comes to you, right? Like, you don't get around that hard work, and you show up. So I wrote back to, in a sense, I responded to Adam Grant by saying, there's not a certain kind of procrastination. Yeah, there's delay in our lives, but don't make this an excuse. We can't turn a vice into a virtue, even though we want to. So I'm all for what you're saying, is that don't believe that. It is a myth.